Alright, this is my Redshift console, and this is the cluster that I had created earlier in section 2. I have reduced the number of nodes to 2, and the node type is same, dc2.large. We have already seen all the other things, but now what I'll do is that I'll show you how do we run queries. So either you can click here in query data, and here there are two options: query in query editor and then query in query editor v2. So I'll be using query editor v2. Apart from this option, you can also look at here and it will open query editor v2 in a new tab. Okay, so this is query editor v2. Let's have a walkthrough of the query editor. So this is the editor, and there are some other options also. Before going to the other options, let me show you that you can change the mode. I am in dark mode now, so it can be light mode also. So click on this, and dark mode looks better actually. And if you click on this gear button, if you see here, there are a lot of options. We have editor preferences, connections, account settings, and Amazon Q generative SQL settings. So click on editor preferences. Here you can edit the font size, the tab size, etc. I do not want to change anything here. Then I'll go to account settings. I'll not talk about connections as of now. I'll go to account settings. So here I have already made some changes. So now if you see, it says maximum concurrent connections using query editor v2. So how many connections can I make? What is the maximum connection that I can make? I already have it at 10, so it cannot be more than 10. We can reduce it. Then there's another option whether query editor can allow to export the result set that we run using SQL. I have enabled this. Then it also has general settings like if you want to show sample databases and S3 URI. So I can mention an S3 bucket where all my data is. The next one is connections. So if you click on connections, so it tells you what cluster we have, what databases you have. Right now do not have any connections, so that's why it is not showing anything. But again, you will not use it mostly. We'll use connections here. We'll change connection properties here. I'll come back to this later on. Okay, the next tab is queries. It actually shows you the queries that you have saved. So if I run some queries, I can save it. Currently I do not have any saved queries, so that's why it is blank. We can save it later on. Then it gives you a notebook option also, so I can create some notebooks. Again, I'll not use it much. We can use charts wherein you can actually visualize the output of your query. Then history of SQL that you have run. Actually I have run multiple queries on this particular cluster on the dev database. So this is the time when the query was started, what was the status, what was the duration of the query, and whether there's any query ID or not, what SQL query did I run, and against which Redshift cluster or Redshift serverless workgroup. And in this cluster, against which database I ran this particular query. So you can see all the query history that you have run using query editor. Then you can schedule queries also using query editor, meaning that let's say you want to run certain queries at a certain time on a cluster. So let's say I want to run or I want to schedule queries on this particular cluster. You can do that using scheduled queries. Okay, so let me go back to editor. So right now I do not have any tab, and this is the cluster. So the name of the cluster is data engineering on AWS Redshift cluster. And if you expand this, you'll see the databases that you have. This is the system database. This is the dev database. If you remember, while creating the cluster, we had mentioned that we want to create one database, that is dev database. And what I had done is that I had also checked the load sample dataset. So that's why it is showing me the sample dataset also. But we'll not use this. We'll create our own database. I can create a tab here. I can create multiple tabs, and I can name these tabs. So what I'll do is I will mention this as DDL queries. right? So what I'll do here, I'll run DDL queries. I will create tables and create views, etc. in this particular tab. And if I want, I can add more tab either in an editor or a notebook. I'll use the editor and I'll name it as, let's say, DML queries, and I have these two tab available. So now let me go ahead and create a database. So the name of the database is 3IAMDB. Once you write this SQL statement, you have to mention, click on run. Now this database would be created. So if you see, this is the result. And now if I refresh here, if I click on this particular button, the 3IAMDB would be shown in the cluster. So if you see, I have created this 3IAM database. Alright, so now I'll go ahead and create tables, views, etc. So this is Query Editor. Now one more thing, I can save this, and let's say I can save it as DDL query. So now what I have to do is that there are a few more things that you have to look at in Query Editor v2. The first one is limit 100. So what it means is that we can see only the first 100 rows of any output. There's something called isolated session, and here the cluster name and the database name. Now this is important because I have selected dev database, but actually I have created 3IAMDB. I'll have to go to 3IAMDB and I'll have to create tables there. So I'll have to select this 3IAMDB here, and now whatever I run will be run in 3IAMDB itself. And this is, again, using this you can schedule and then we can save. So this is at a high level what Query Editor v2 is, and we'll be running a lot of queries in Query Editor v2, and we'll also be using RSQL. So now let us go ahead and install RSQL for our use. But before that, I wanted to show you that the client machine that we have. So I had launched an EC2 instance in my account, and this is the instance that I had launched. So the name of the EC2 instance is Redshift Client RSQL, because I will be installing RSQL here. And these are the details. Just wanted to show you a few things, that the instance type is t3.large, and this is the VPC, data engineering on AWS VPC, and I have created this in the public subnet. So data engineering on AWS VPC public subnet 1B. Now why I have created it in public subnet? Because I want to SSH into this EC2 instance and then install RSQL, and from there I'll connect to Redshift cluster, which is in my private subnet. So it will work as a jump box and Redshift client for my Redshift cluster. One more thing, if we click on security, and the security group that I have assigned is this one. If you see the inbound rule, all traffic is allowed from 0000, and this is the security group, data engineering on AWS VPC public security group. Now what I'll do is that I will log into this EC2 instance, and using a public IP address which is not available yet, accidentally I created the machine with auto assign IP address disabled. I will change it. I'll have to terminate it and recreate it. Let me do that, and then I'll log into the EC2 instance and install RSQL there. My EC2 instance is up and running, and in this particular EC2 instance I'm going to install RSQL. Remember one thing, that launch the EC2 instance with Amazon Linux 2, not Amazon Linux 2023. Just let me show you so that it is clear. I am clicking on launch instance, and in the AMI it says Amazon Linux, which is fine. But in the description or in the details, when it loads up, it will tell you which Amazon Linux machine is this one. So in my case, it is showing Amazon Linux 2023 AMI. You should not use Amazon Linux 2023 AMI. Rather, you should use Amazon Linux 2 AMI. Do not launch the EC2 instance with 2023, but launch it with Amazon Linux 2. Once the instance is launched, it is up and running. Of course, we'll have to SSH into the EC2 instance. And this is the key pair that I have created to log into the EC2 instance. Let me go ahead and SSH into it. So I have logged in to the EC2 instance. So now I'll have to install RSQL. So there are few steps to install RSQL. Those high level steps are, first you'll have to install OpenSSL in using Unix ODBC. So this is the command sudo yum install Unix ODBC OpenSSL. After this is done, we'll have to install Redshift ODBC driver. If you remember, I had told you that if you are using any command line interface, you'll have to install the ODBC driver. So without an ODBC driver, you cannot use the command line interface. So that's why we'll have to install Redshift ODBC driver. After that, we'll have to set some environment variables, and then we'll have to install RSQL. Now all these commands are there in the command sheet for this particular section. So let's complete the steps one by one. The first step is that we'll have to install Unix ODBC OpenSSL, which is getting installed now. So it is complete. Now the next step is install the Redshift ODBC driver. And this is the command to install Redshift ODBC driver. It might take a few minutes or a few seconds to complete. By the way, it actually took a few seconds to complete. So the ODBC driver has been installed. Next step is to copy the ODBC INI file in my home directory. So in this case, this is where the ODBC INI file is, and I'm copying it to my home directory. Now the next step is to install RSQL, and this is the command to install RSQL from an RPM package which is in S3. So RSQL has been installed. Now, there are some additional steps that you have to do. You will have to remove the libpq version 5. Instead of that, you'll have to use the libpq version which is provided with Redshift RSQL, and these are the two commands that I'll have to run. Now next, I'll have to configure bash rc. So I'm in my home directory /home/ec2 user. So if I do an lsla, I have bash profile, bash rc files. So I'll have to configure the bash rc file, and here I'll configure these variables: ODBC INI, ODBC sys INI, and Amazon Redshift ODBC INI. Let me save it. Now I'll have to source it because I am in the same session. So if you do not want to run this source command, what you have to do is that you'll have to log out and log in back again. If I source bash rc again, now my environment is ready to run the RSQL command and log into the remote Redshift server. Now the command is rsql-h. Here I'll have to provide the Redshift endpoint. Now how do I get the Redshift endpoint? This is my Redshift cluster console or Redshift cluster homepage. Here you can see we have this endpoint, and this is the entire endpoint which contains the port and the database also. So either you can mention the entire thing or remove the port and database, and then mention the administrative user, which is admin in our case, then the database, which is dev, and port, which is 5439. And now it will prompt for the password, and in our case the password was whatever password you had mentioned while creating the cluster. And now I am inside of Redshift cluster, and I'm ready to run my Redshift commands. Now which Redshift cluster I have logged into? This is the cluster name that is highlighted. So the name of the cluster is Data Engineering on AWS Redshift cluster. Now there are some RSQL commands which we can use to see the databases, tables, etc. These are called meta commands. Let us explore some of the meta commands. So the first one is /l. It is similar to PSQL. If you are familiar with PostgreSQL PSQL, it is similar to that. But if you are not from PostgreSQL background, that is fine. /l will show you all the databases which are there. In our case, we have AWS Data Catalog, Dev Database, and some other databases. I had also created 3IAM database earlier. Let me go ahead and delete that. So I have deleted the 3IAM database. Now if I run /l, it will show me the databases that we have. This is an internal database. This is also an internal database. Template 0, template 1, forget about it. These are the databases based on which the new databases are created. Basically, these are template databases. Again, you do not have to worry about these things. So using /l, we can see all the databases. And then using /c, I can connect to a database. Now, right now I have only dev database. So now I am connected to the dev database. As you can see, it tells me that you are now connected to database dev as user admin. Now here, if I run /d, it tells me all the tables that my dev database has and who has created those tables. So if you see, I have some tables. By the way, all these tables are empty. Let's say you want to expand a particular table. So let's say the customers table. So you want to see the details of customer tables. How do you do that? It is /d plus and then the customer table. So if I type this, it shows me all the columns, its data types, and some other features also. Now some features like encoding, dist key, sort key, etc. These are specific to Redshift, and that's where RSQL is different than PostgreSQL's command line interface. So using RSQL, we can see Redshift specific information. Now I have some unique constraints, primary key, etc. I will talk about it later on, but I just wanted to show you how RSQL works. The next command is /dn, which can be used to list the schemas. The command is /dn. Again, we'll talk about schema shortly. Then one more command that I wanted to show you now is /du, which actually shows you the users that are there. Currently, I have only two users, admin, which I created while creating the cluster, and RDSDB. Now, RDSDB is an internal user. We cannot remove it, we cannot change it, we cannot do anything. So this is this user would be there by default, but the admin user is something that we created while creating the cluster. Now in the user section, I'll be creating a lot more users and roles in the hands-on demo. So that's all about installation of RSQL. Now you can go ahead and install RSQL on an EC2 instance that you have launched and connect to the Redshift cluster that you have created.